Hey, and welcome back to the Music History Project. Today is part 2 of our 2-part series on Henry Steinway. If you didn't listen to part 1, go back to your iTunes store or your listening platform and check it out. Here we go. Welcome to the Music History Project. We're your hosts. I'm Elizabeth Dale.
And Dan Del Fiorentino.
And Mike Mullins.
All of our content comes from the Oral History Program, which is sponsored by NAM, the National Association of Music Merchants. And that is a program that is over 3,000 interviews and constantly growing. If you want to check out any of our content or any of the other interviews that aren't featured, please check out our website at www.nam.org/library.
So here we are again, listening to the wonderful and very entertaining interview from 2001 with Henry Steinway for the NAM Oral History Program. And it was really neat to listen to his earlier recollections of the company and his family. And I think in this second part, we're going to be talking a little bit more about the growth of the company during his own time as president and employee of the Steinway Piano Company.
Yeah, so let's jump right into it. And our first segment is going to be Henry talking about some of the more crowning moments, the defining moments that really make Steinway stand apart from the rest of the industry, as well as some collaborations and projects that he's worked on along with Steinway. And we're really excited. Here we go.
What comes to mind as some of the kind of the crowning moments, the collaborations that have given Steinway prestige?
Well, there were quite a few. To give you the history of it, when Steinway finally achieved placing this first gift into the White House, Nahum assigned Stetson, one of his secretaries, who would go to Washington, work with the wife of the president on programs. And so that tradition of consulting Mrs. President about social life continued up until, about Eisenhower's time, when there started to be a big office there now. Now, the wife of the president, they can handle all kinds of stuff. They don't need somebody from New York. But my brother John used to go down there, and he knew the chief usher, who's the guy who runs the White House. He's called chief usher, but he's really general manager of the White House. And so that was the contact we'd see. Sometimes we'd go down with the artist. John would go down with them and make sure they got there on time and all that sort of thing. And I would say some of the exciting ones were, of course, Van Cliburn, who was a big excitement. Next to Paderewski, I think he is a name that resonates everywhere because of this remarkable thing, not only that he won, but the fact that he had a ticket tape parade here in New York, and he's been in the White House several times. And of course, coming from Texas, when Lyndon Johnson was president, he was there on several occasions. So those Cliburn moments have been great. And then Horowitz played there, and that was quite interesting. And then there are the playing presidents, like Truman used to play the piano, Nixon played the piano. And we always offer a piano for the private quarters if they want it. And so it's regular grand or upright, whatever they want. And I think it was during the Nixon years, we got a call from the White House saying, we have a great publicity idea. We want to give the Truman Library the Steinway that's in the private room. We see you own it. So how about it? So what could we do but give it to the White House? And then Nixon officially presented this to Truman, the Democrat, for his library. And there was nice publicity gimmick. They both sat down and played it and all that sort of thing. So it was a nice occasion. There is a book by a lady named Elise Kirk that describes music in the White House from the beginning. Very interesting, what pianos were there and what music was played and all that sort of stuff. And somebody told me that they're working on a documentary now, a PBS show, that may be a 2-hour show that'll be music in the White House. And all the different things. They've had popular artists there. They've had all kinds of people. So that's about what I know about the White House.
Interesting. In general, since you were so closely involved with it during your own period of time, what were some of the more prestigious collaborations that you have been a part of in terms of Steinway?
It's hard to say. It all gets to be a sort of a unreeling tape in my memory, but one of the things that was a great occasion was our 100th anniversary in the year 1953, where through our then concert manager, Alexander Greiner, it was arranged that the New York Philharmonic would play, and we would have 10 pianists play. And this was a wonderful and interesting occasion. And Ed Sullivan, who was the biggest thing in TV at that time, said, I want to do a, quote, picture of the rehearsal. So on Sunday night before this concert, which I think was on a Monday or something like that, in Carnegie Hall, we set up 8 pianos, and they played under the directorship of, I've forgotten now who it was, a distinguished old guy. And this was a remote, which in those days was rather tricky. Ed Sullivan was in the theater, and he'd say, now we're going to try a remote from Carnegie Hall. We don't know where. And his son-in-law, I think, was the producer. And sure, the thing worked, and they picked it up. And my father and mother were in the audience, and he had them stand up. And I've got a film clip of it somewhere. It was... But that was an exciting event, because that was my father's sort of swan song. That's what he was interested in, was this thing. He wrote a book, People and Pianos, that's a wonderful book with pictures about the thing. And we had this celebration, and afterwards a big party at the Waldorf. And the next day, all the dealers came here for a cocktail party, and we introduced a special piano that had been designed by Walter Darwin Teague, who, name now forgotten, but was one of the big industrial designers of the day. So that's an exciting event that I remember, and there were others going way back. Joseph Hoffman, which was perhaps one of the most outstanding pianists that ever lived, in 1937 had a 50th anniversary of his first performance in the Metropolitan Opera House, which was then used for things other than opera. And it was still the old Opera House down on 34th Street. And so, again, they had a concert of Joseph Hoffman, and then afterwards, a sort of an in-group came here to Steinway's, and they sat up all night drinking and talking and so on, and I remember that with great interest. He was a very fascinating guy, Hoffman. He was one of the few pianists who was interested in how the piano works. And there was a recent article on him about why there are no recordings. He was not happy with acoustic recordings, and he was constantly experimenting with new ways of recording. And he eventually did, and I think they patched together from, he did make player tapes, but they've made some recordings now that are Joseph Hoffman. He had a command of the piano that was extraordinary. He made it sing. He made it sound good. That's, of course, what we love in the piano business.
In our previous segment of the podcast for Henry's interview, we talked a little bit about his relationship with dealers. And I thought maybe this would be a good time to talk to Mike, who grew up in the music store, about the importance of working with the suppliers, with the retailers. What is your take on the importance of that relationship?
Well, I think with the entire music industry, it's all about the relationships, because you never really want to work with someone unless you get along with them, unless you would, I don't know, you're interested in the same things, they're nice people. So I definitely believe that the relationship between manufacturers and dealers has to be a strong one in order for it to work. And judging by how good of a guy Henry seems, I'm sure he had plenty of excellent relationships with his dealers, and that would further the company, would help Steinway get into more stores.
it's almost as if they're doing him a favor. They want to help Henry,
Right.
you know, for the better cause kind of thing.
Yeah, and I'm sure that happens with plenty of stores where it's more so about the people than it is the brand.
Yeah, well said. I think you're right. But of course, the brand in this case sure didn't hurt.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's one of the strongest brands.
Too hard to sell Steinway, but I don't know.
I mean, ever since I started working at NAM, when you introduce yourself at a party or, you know, around family members or whatever and trying to explain what you do for a living and say, well, it's part of the music products industry, I always say, you know, like Steinway and Fender. Because
Right.
you figure between those two, somebody's going to figure out what it is that you do. And that's all the names you have to drop, I think.
Yeah.
Unless you're my mom, then you still don't understand. But whatever. Yeah, so let's hear Henry talking about the relationships that he has as the face of Steinway with its dealers. And then he's also going to talk about the relationships in the NAMM show, which is always great to hear some of these interviewees kind of plug the NAMM show, because that's why we have jobs.
As I say, the basic arrangement was set by Nahum Stetson years ago, with the idea that you are appointed a Steinway dealer for a certain territory, and that is yours, and we won't put another dealer. In the old days, maybe we still do, you draw lines on the map and say, this is your territory, and this is his, and that's there. And so the Steinway franchise is much valued and sought after, and becomes a sort of a privilege to be earned, and you earn it by doing these other promotional activities. And that's pretty much the way it's been since the beginning. And as I say, it was set up by Nahum Stetson. Then it was carried on by a fellow named Ernest Erks, whom he had hired and trained. Hired him away from Chickering, strangely enough, and he was with us for years. And then in the 20s and up into my time, we had a wonderful fellow, Roman Domajewski. He was a Polish-born sort of aristocrat who had he fought in the French army against the Germans in the war, and then didn't want to go back to Poland, and he was in London for a while. Then he came to New York and became our general sales manager all through the time when you had to travel by railroad. And as he got older, he said, I'd fly from here to Newark, said I don't want to ever get in the train again, because those old sleepers and all that sort of stuff. And then he was succeeded by another man named Howard Cushing, and so it's up to really, Frank Mazurko, who's our executive vice president, is now in charge of all the distribution as well as other things. So that's our sales thing, and it's the same basic thread runs to it from the time Stetson started to set these things up. Way back, there were a lot of Germans in the business, and interestingly and historically, our distribution, we were selling pianos in St. Louis, Missouri, before we were selling them in Boston, because Boston was Chickering territory full of Yankees, and we couldn't get a dealer up there. But in St. Louis, there are a lot of Germans, in Milwaukee and in Cincinnati, and those were strong points for Steinway's early distribution. And then when Stetson came in, he traveled the country and had travelers out there and picked up these guys like Leander S. Sherman, the founder of Sherman Clay, was a remarkable fellow, and developed that business. And then Lyon & Healy in Chicago was also a powerhouse. Old Pat Healy, who came from Boston, I think, and had gone to the Middle West. And that's why I think it's so important for the museum to preserve this history of these stores. Like the existing one, Schmidt Music, is now in its 4th generation, and it's really extraordinary. I mean, the original Schmidt was sent out there as a sheet music dealer. That's the way it starts. Then he bought the store, and then he added band instruments, and then his grandson, my age, Bob Schmidt, was the guy who got them into keyboards, and the whole thing just grew like that. And those stories are the ones that I think should be preserved for the American history.
Absolutely. What are your thoughts about the more successful approaches of lining up a relationship with a dealer? Is it the one-on-one contact, some of the people that you've had? Do things like NAMM's trade show fall into these categories? How
Yes.
does that work?
there's no substitute for a one-on-one contact, and that's why Steinway now operates with, I think it's 4 or 5 district managers who are responsible for a geographic district of the United States. And that's their job, to travel constantly with those dealers. Now, once a year they come in here and they have their meetings and they plan, and they offer a lot of suggested promotions. And as some of the smart dealers tell me, says, we can't do them all, but they're good ideas, and we pick this and that, and they have different promotions, such as one that's been used often is this Steinway Factory event. We ship a lot of pianos, and they say, this weekend you can have this wonderful display of Steinway pianos and special selection. That's something Bill McCormick thought up and still uses pretty effectively. And I don't know the others, but there are a series of promotions. One of them mentioned the Horowitz piano. They have what they call legendary pianos. There's a Kleiben piano, a Horowitz piano, and then they often send another one, such as we had an art case made in honor of Gershwin, and it's sort of a cute piano, all in blue, Rhapsody in blue, and the desk represents the skyline of New York, and so that one sometimes is used as a third one on this display. So NAMM show is extremely important for the dealers to come.
One of the most compelling moments, I believe, of Henry Steinway's professional career was the moment where he realized that he needed to sell the company outside of the family, and that was the first time that ever happened to the Steinway Company, and this is in the late 1960s when the conglomerates of the world were taking over just about every aspect of business, and in particular the music industry. And it was a very hard decision. It wasn't one that fell in favor by many of his other family members and colleagues and employees at Steinway, but it was one that Henry very heartfelt felt he had to do. So he sold to CBS, the broadcaster that had a division of musical instruments at the time, and later owned Fender guitars and several other big names in the music products industry. So what's interesting is that there's a whole lot of conjecture about what that was and what that was like, but it's really neat to hear Henry's own words about that. So let's get his take on the selling of Steinway to CBS.
Your father turned over the reins almost 50 years ago.
Yeah.
What would he think about the state of Steinway now?
I really don't know. It's hard to say, because he was very emotional about preserving Steinway all through the Depression, and there are times when he should have closed it up and liquidated it, as many piano business did, many good ones. Matuszek, I don't know how many that went out of business then, but he kept the flag flying. And when we merged with CBS, my mother was against it because Father wouldn't have liked it. And I said, well, it's the wave of the future. We got to do it. And I didn't know till the meeting whether she was going to vote her stock for or against it, but she did vote for it finally. And I think I'd convinced her that it was the right thing. But what my father would have thought, I don't really know, because he would have been bewildered, I think, at the loss of family control. That was so important to him. But I am sure I did the right thing at that time. There is a progression to family businesses in this country. It's interesting to see that the Ford grandson has now taken over as chief executive officer of Ford. Most unusual after many intervals. And I'm a great admirer of his, whether it was grandfather or whoever it was, Henry Ford II, who was plucked out of the Navy and straightened that thing out at that time. But in general, you have a family business, it's run, then it goes into professional hands. And that's what makes me feel good today, is that we are in professional hands with Bruce as president and the financial people and all that sort of thing. And they've all been there for 10, 15 years now, so they must like it, and it must be good. The Dennis Hansen, who's the chief financial officer, has been there for many years, and they still maintain. When the Birminghams owned it, they made a company, Steinway Musical Instruments, in Mass, and that's still the holding company for Steinway. And they have a small office there that controls the fiscal stuff, which I guess reports directly to the owners in Santa Monica. But the other people in Astoria all seem to be steady, and I know I don't go out to the factory as much as I used to, but when I do, there's a nice spirit there, a nice feeling of the employees that things are going well.
It's terrific.
So I feel very upbeat about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you should. What amazes me is some of the history of the last 15 or 20 years of keyboard development, synthesizers and electronic pianos and so on and so forth. And
right.
In a lot of respects, you got a run for your money, as it were, and stability and consistency and the reputation of fine craftsmanship, which your company certainly has.
Right.
In my estimation, probably was one of the major factors in your...
Absolutely. No doubt. And in fact, I remember when we sold to CBS, they said, don't ask me to do anything electronic. If you want to use electronic, get some other company to do electronics, which they never did, I'm glad to say. But the electronic piano, whatever the piano is, the Rolands and those sort of things, are so good that there's no question that they have affected the inexpensive regular piano business that used to exist. Are truly remarkable what they can do. You plug them in, they work. If the kids want to practice, you can even turn them off and they have earphones and all that sort of stuff. So they're here to stay and getting better all the time, and I guess cheaper. I don't know whether that's happening. So that's a big change in the industry, but there's ultimately nothing like a true live piano that you play yourself. And that's what our customers like, and that's the kind of customers we try and find.
So that was Henry talking about the decision to sell Steinway out of the family and to CBS, the same people that bought Fender, as Dan mentioned. And, it must have been hard going into that board meeting, not knowing how everybody was going to vote. And it sounded, his mom telling him leading up to it that she didn't think his dad would like that, but Henry knowing it was the right move at the time for him and everything, and then to have his mom end up ultimately supporting him, I think just shows a lot of the dynamic of the family.
Yeah. I mean, what a tough decision, though. I mean, imagine even just like a smaller family business, selling it out of the family's tough, but selling this globally recognized name that's been in your family for generations, that's got to be tough.
But you know what? He was always very positive about the role that he could play, and that role developed over time to basically being the kingpin again. Mm-hmm. He wasn't the president of the company, but he was the head. He was the face, figure. So to speak, yeah, for sure. And to the point of when people would come and select their Steinway in the basement of Steinway Hall, Henry would go down and sign the piano for them. He was still there. He was still very much involved. And as a result of that, he had a real understanding as to the growth of that and how it changed from owner to owner. There were several people, the Birmingham brothers, for example, purchased it from CBS and invested a lot of money to develop that factory again. Henry was there and recognized their efforts. And because he saw that they were dedicated to it, he tried that much harder to play his role in promoting and marketing the company again, which I think is very noble of him. I think a lot of other people might have been bitter about that, but he did not, and remained very true to the core values of the company, which was started by his ancestors.
So with that being said, we can kind of move away from one challenge, and that was making the decision to sell the company outside of the family, to another, which was the competition that Steinway faced with the invention of the player piano coming out and piano rolls, player piano rolls. So it's really interesting to hear Henry's take on that new invention and how that impacted them.
You, as Steinway, had a very similar challenge about 100 years ago when the player piano and the piano roll came out.
Right. I think that was very astutely handled by Charles H. Steinway, our second president, because it was what he did was make an arrangement with the Aeolian Company that made the machinery. And we had a 30-year contract from 1911 or some figure like that, in which we would furnish pianos. The grand piano had to be structured a little differently, so you could put this big blower in there that was all suck and blow pneumatics and that sort of stuff. And so we would sell them to the Aeolian Company. The Aeolian Company would put in the machinery and sell them to the dealers. And this worked pretty well for both of us for many, many years. And that's why you see a piano that says Steinway Duo-Watt. Duo-Watt was the ultimate. They started with pianola, I think, for the uprights, and then this Duo-Watt was the thing as they got the more sophisticated machinery. And that contract lasted right up until the Depression, when Aeolian went busted and eventually combined with the American piano, which was the other big one, as the Aeolian American. And they junked the Aeolian machinery and kept the Apico machinery. And we made a few during the 30s. Somebody would get an order, and then that was the end of that. Now, of course, the whole concept has been revived in the modern technology, and we sell a lot of pianos, I'm told, in which are inserted this new machine. And that's come back. But meanwhile, there are collector societies that still collect the old player rolls and refix them. And engineers, for some reason, love it because it's so different from electronics. It was done by mechanics, and you can fix it yourself if you're slightly handy. You get the repair manual. Oh, there's 17 pneumatic tubes. You take out the old ones and put in the new ones. It's not a question of taking the circuit out and shoving a new circuit in. So you can find your trouble and fix it yourself, and a lot of people like that. So the player piano, certainly the biggest year of the piano business was about 1903 or 4 for the total piano business. Something like 400,000 new pianos left factories in that year. And half of them were players. And there were big companies that made the player machinery and so forth and inserted ones. And then, as I say, it just dropped dead in 1927. And the whole thing was absolutely over. So it was a strange sort of thing. And then when you think back, after all, 1904 and 5, when this peak period arrived, was when the movies were coming in, the automobile was starting to become cheap enough for somebody to really use, and our habits changed in a way that made the piano less essential as home entertainment. And then in 1927, the big change again, network radio, had us all sitting looking at a box, which is what we're still doing. So that's the long-range story on that.
So as Elizabeth just was alluding to, the challenges there of the competition of the player piano, I remember reading in the music trade magazines that in 1901, which is the year that NAMM was established, there were more player pianos being sold than bathtubs in the United States. And I don't know if that means that musicians and dirt go hand in hand. I don't know. But thinking of it from the Steinway perspective, boy, that's a lot of competition out there all of a sudden. These player pianos, for the first time ever, somebody could have a musical instrument in their home and not know how to play a note. It was no longer a required element of purchasing a piano, and so they had some stiff competition. One of the things that they did to combat that, which isn't discussed in this interview but is discussed in a second interview that we did with him years later, you could have a piece of art in your home, and they would create these amazing pianos called the art case pianos, which were high-end, beautiful. They play great, of course, but they looked brilliant. They had a lot of wood carving on the legs, for example, and then they would paint on the sides and on the top different scenes. There was one that was here in the Museum of Making Music from 1905 called the dance of the ballerina. And the first picture on the right of the piano had a young woman in basically shabby clothes and rags, but learning how to dance. And as you walk around the piano, she got a little bit better. Her mother made her a dress. And then on the very top is where she debuted as a ballerina. And so here is a talking piece that you could have in your home. It's a piece of art. You can walk around it. You can invite all the people over for a party. And if you're smart and don't know how to play it, because this is when people started purchasing pianos that didn't know how to play, you could have some sheet music of the latest song on there and hope that one of your guests will know how to play so you can finally hear what your piano sounds like. It was a really clever solution, and of course the people who did know how to play and could afford it also had something to make music with, as well as a very interesting piece to talk about in their home. So that is a very brilliant way that the Steinway Company addressed some of their competition when the player pianos first came out. They also had the challenges that we're going to hear about next in this segment from Henry's interview about the stencil piano. And if you know that story, it was basically when less than reputable manufacturers were putting names of pianos that were very close to sounding like pianos that you recognize, like Steinway or Baldwin, and they were just slightly misspelled enough to get some people who didn't pay close enough attention fooled. And so these stenciling pianos was really an undertaking of the Steinway Company. They went to Washington and, along with some other folks, really did away with that. There were some laws that finally got enacted that allowed that to be illegal. But it also motivated 53 dealers to get together at a piano manufacturing meeting in 1901 and start a charter of a new organization that we now know as NAMM. So there's some good that came from that, of course, and we all got a job as a result of all those guys getting together.
And now you get to go to a NAMM show twice a year.
That's right.
Because people were trying to copy
make
Steinways.
counterfeit pianos. So thank you, seedy underbelly of America.
So let's hear Henry's take on the stencil pianos.
Oh, stencil pianos, yes. That came in the, I think, the 80s or sometime around then. The manufacturers started to make them, and many of them did give Steinway a hot foot with similar names. So that's but the stencil piano as such was an important development in the piano business. And there was a man in the 90s who had a big factory, and I just can't think of his name at the moment, who really developed that business. He was a Yankee, and he analyzed the piano business, and he thought it could be made by mass production means. And he would put any name on anybody wanted. And it developed that business, which of course Steinway hated, but that's what's happened, and it's endemic ever since. A lot of these large companies that Nahum Stetson put in business, like Sherman Clay and like Lyon and Healy, they either had their own factory at some point, or when they gave up their factory, they had Lyon and Healy pianos. Steinert today has somebody make a piano called Steinert, and so this stencil piano thing exists. And I guess it fits in today with marketing, like these guys who make clothes seem to put it on perfume and underwear and God knows everything else, so that it's become more sophisticated than it used to be.
Okay, so what are we going to do next?
Looks like we've got our final section here, hearing from Henry Steinway. And let's see, he is going to be talking about merchandise outside of the pianos, as well as the arrival of the Centennial Steinway to the Museum of Making Music. And I just wanted to say, too, that Henry had a large part in the opening of the Museum of Making Music, if I'm correct.
Yeah, he was the first president of the Museum of Making Music's board. There is a gallery that's dedicated to him, or Gallery 4, and he loved this place. We used to joke that when he would get awards for other museum involvement, because he loved museums, by the way. He traveled all over the world and would always go to a museum wherever he went. When he was given an award at the Smithsonian in Washington, he took his time for his acceptance speech to talk about our museum, which was really cool, something that we like to brag about.
I think one of the successes is that we never did try anything else. Various attempts of a small nature were considered, but nothing really like that, and it did give some trouble to a lot of people. The Story and Clark Company in the 20s went into the radio business, and then Atwater Kent came out with a small cheap radio, and they were out of business on that. They lost a lot of money. The old Kimball Company in Chicago made laboratory furniture, which was then wood, and I think they lost a bundle on that. So that Steinway never really, we just stuck to the knitting and made the Steinway piano, and that was it.
A proud moment for us at NAMM and the Museum of Making Music coming up in a couple of months will be the arrival of the Centennial Steinway.
Yes.
To celebrate the 100th anniversary of NAMM. Tell me about that.
Well, I don't really know whose idea that was, but I think it was a wonderful idea. And I know the piano was here in Steinway Hall for a while to collect, when we had any distinguished artists come through, we had them sign it. So this piano has on its plate a bunch of signatures to NAMM, and I'm thrilled with the idea that the headquarters will have a Steinway piano there, and it will be presented when? I've forgotten when.
I believe it's February or March. It's coming up quite quickly.
Yeah. So I don't know what kind of ceremony. Is it going to be out there, I assume, in Carlsbad? Yeah.
Yes. We have a couple of things planned, but I think from my point of view, from the curator's standpoint, and some of the special programs that we've been able to put on, it'll be so wonderful to have an in-house piano.
Absolutely.
And we can't think of a better one to have. So
absolutely.
We're greatly appreciative.
I think it's great, and of course we're thrilled that they have a Steinway at NAMM, and it'll be there, it'll be used, and I'm sure it'll be made available when you, I know those facilities are used by all kinds of people, and so there it is, and the piano should be used. That's the idea of it.
Once again, thanks for joining us for this conclusion of our two-part series on Henry Steinway. We look forward to having you in 2 weeks for our next episode. Later, skaters.
Bye-bye.
Bye.